Good day. As with all my recent programs, this program will be primarily about the situation in Ukraine, and this time I'm going to focus to the extent that I can on military developments, though I would say that it's actually always difficult to get information from the Donbass front lines, partly because journalists don't seem to be visiting that area to any great degree. They don't seem to be close to the battlefields. The Russians, so far as I'm aware, don't do what Western militaries now do, which is have embedded journalists with their forces, probably a good thing, by the way. And as a result, information is not always very easy to come by. I would add, and this is a point which has been made by various people, including Jacob Dreisen, in his latest video and his latest comments on his website, I get the impression, like him, that there is a certain amount of military censorship, especially from the Russian side, about the latest military developments. But I think we can summarize the situation fairly quickly and along these lines. The great Ukrainian counteroffensive northeast of Kharkiv, which we have been hearing a great deal about, seems to have achieved little in practice. There does seem to have been a Russian redeployment from that particular part of Ukraine. The result was that certain villages that had previously been occupied by the Russians apparently were easy to reoccupy by the Ukrainians. There doesn't seem to have been very much fighting, and in fact there's now some scattered reports that some Ukrainian forces in this area have actually been pushed back by Russian counter-moves in this particular part of the battlefield. Well, I don't want to discuss this in any great detail. I've always felt that this counteroffensive near Kharkiv has been largely over-discussed or over-described. What I would say is that there are reports from Kharkiv itself that, contrary to some reports, Russian artillery is still within range of the city, and there are still occasional artillery strikes on the city, though nothing like on the scale that was the case before the major Russian pullbacks in northern Ukraine in March. And in addition to this, I want to just deal with one particular claim that's been made by many sources, which is that this advance somehow endangers Russian supply lines to Donbass. Well, I'm not an expert on these matters, as I often have occasion to say, but various people, Larry Johnson is one example, but lots of other people also, are now making the point that this is simply completely untrue, that Russian supply lines to Donbass do not pass through this area or come anywhere close to this area. Most Russian forces operating in Donbass receive their supply lines from different directions, and to the extent that they pass through Kharkiv region, they pass southeast of the city, not northeast of the city, as they advance from the Russian border. So the great offensive in or close to Kharkiv seems to have run out of steam, to the extent that it was ever an offensive at all, and has not achieved anything of any great importance or significance. The Ukrainians do speak a great deal about the fact that they may have reached the border between Ukraine and Russia in several places, but a point which is perhaps not widely understood, the Ukrainians have in fact been able to regain access to their border in along several parts of the Ukrainian-Russian border since the big pullbacks by the Russians at the end of March, and these minor deployments close to the border are without much significance. Importantly, there are still Russian formations northeast of Kharkiv, which are on the Ukrainian side of the border. And as I said, it seems that the Ukrainians are not making much progress against these. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the Kharkiv counteroffensive. As I always say, I'm not on the ground. I'm not a tactical expert. If people want to come back and claim that I misunderstood the situation completely and that this is a huge Ukrainian advance and a dramatic Russian retreat, well, they're perfectly welcome to. But what I would say is I am confident of the reliability of the information that I'm getting, and I am sure that my account is correct. However, there's been much more muddle and uncertainty about this other battle that took place a couple of days ago, the Russian crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River. Now, in my first video about the subject, I said that this looked like a clear-cut Russian defeat. Then in a follow-up video that I did, I pulled back a little. I said that I had not realized that the photographs that have been published so extensively of this battle all came from Ukrainian sources. That made me much more skeptical about what was being reported. And I'd read reports which I thought might be plausible, that the Ukrainians might have been conflating a defeat that they suffered when they tried to cross the Seversky Donetsk River with this Russian setback, which, however, did undoubtedly take place because the Russians themselves have confirmed this. Anyway, I now have clarity on this. I want to say now clearly and unequivocally that all the pictures that we have seen of this incident near the Seversky Donetsk River show Russian military equipment. They do not show Ukrainian military equipment. It does not seem as if there has been any conflation of photographs. However, what does seem to be the case is that a fair amount of this equipment that we see there, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles, the trucks, and all the rest, which many people had assumed had been destroyed, that much of it is actually intact. And there's some suggestions that it might have been abandoned by the Russians, but I've seen other drone footage, other footage of this, which shows what appear to be Russian troops there and some of these tanks maneuvering. And it's quite possible that, in fact, the Russians were in the process of pulling back some of this equipment from this crossing after the pontoon bridge was destroyed. And the most accurate figure that I've seen for the losses, I suspect Russian losses in this particular battle, is, I suspect, the one we originally got from that commentator who spoke to the BBC. He guesstimated Russian losses at 150, which is high, and I'm going to stick with that. That's all I'm going to say about this particular battle. Elsewhere, there were numerous reports about a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Izyum region, one that was going to press and capture or break through the flanks of the Russian concentrations around Izyum, that would threaten Russian supply lines. Some Western commentators seem to be very focused on the issue of Russian supply lines, and which was going to change dramatically the results of the battle. Well, it seems there have been attempted Ukrainian counterattacks in this area, but every one of them has failed, including yet another attempt to cross the Seversky Donetsk River, this from a different direction, to advance from west to east, whereas the Russians presumably are trying to push from east to west. Anyway, that's how it seems. But these, I should say, seem to me to be minor affairs. Well, maybe the Russian defeat in their crossing of the Seversky Donetsk River was not a minor battle in terms of the number of people who might have been killed. But overall, the overall picture in Donbass is becoming ever clearer. It seems that the town of Liman, or Krasny Liman as the Russians still refer to it, Red Liman, that was its Soviet name. That town has now been apparently essentially encircled. There have been other places in this area of the Donbass, the northern Donbass, that have been falling increasingly into Russian hands. Various villages and settlements. The important town of Rabizhnoye now appears to be fully under Russian control, and it seems that increasingly Ukrainian troops in this part of Donbass, this is the northern Donbass, have been divided up into penny packets and are being surrounded by Russian troops. Their communications are being cut off, and this is putting them in a particularly dangerous position. Now, the major Ukrainian concentrations remain in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Russian advances continue towards these, but it is starting to look overall as if we are beginning to see the beginning of the end of the Battle of Donbass. It's taken weeks to work out. Ukrainian fortifications in this part of Ukraine have been extremely dense. Ukrainian fortified lines have been extremely dense in some places, and Ukraine deployed its best troops to this particular part of the battlefield. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the battle has been extremely intense and has taken a very long time to work through. But it does seem as if the Russians are incrementally achieving a major breakthrough in the northern Donbass, and that is putting the entire Ukrainian position in Donbass in very considerable jeopardy. And it may be that this explains some rather important news, or big news, possibly, maybe not in military terms, but maybe in psychological terms, that's now taking place in Mariupol. Now, firstly, I should say that there's reports that the Russians have now reconnected Mariupol to the electricity grid, that there's now finally electric power in the city, that water is also being received in Mariupol. In other words, that essential services are once again working in Mariupol. But of course, the news that everybody is focused on is what is going on in the Azovstal factory. Now, as we all know, at the end of the battle in Mariupol, back in April, the remaining Ukrainian troops in Mariupol withdrew into the Azovstal factory, huge steel factory with large numbers of underground facilities, some of which might have been built by the Soviets as nuclear bunkers. There were large numbers of civilians in these facilities, and there were Ukrainian troops also deployed to these facilities. Now, the exact number of these Ukrainian troops remains at issue. Some say that it's hundreds, some say it's 1,000, some say more than that. A figure of up to 2,000 has been mentioned. And the makeup of these troops is also a topic of some controversy. Are they regular Ukrainian troops from the Ukrainian army, or are they predominantly members of the Azov regiment? Well, I think gradually it's become increasingly clear that they are mainly from the Azov regiment, which is what we were hearing at the start of this siege, but which some disputed as the siege continued. I can't confirm this. I'm sure the Russians by now know one way or the other, but they are not disclosing. Anyway, what is indisputable is that just as there was frenetic attempts by Ukraine before Azovstal was completely closed off to try to evacuate some people from Azovstal. We've never really found out who these people are. But anyway, Ukraine sent helicopter after helicopter into the Azovstal factory, only for these to be destroyed by the Russians. and they also tried to send freight ships into Azovstal to get someone out. And again, all of those were destroyed. Anyway, since then, over the last few weeks, as the situation in Azovstal has become increasingly critical, there have been relentless Ukrainian attempts to try to get the people in Azovstal released to Ukraine. So, firstly, there were negotiations about the release of the civilians at the Azovstal factory, and the Russians managed eventually to get the UN's humanitarian agencies and the International Committee of the Red Cross involved in evacuating the civilians from the Azovstal factory. Well, that was successfully achieved, but the Ukrainians do seem to have tried to get the Ukrainian troops or the Ukrainian wounded in the Azovstal factory included as part of this evacuation, except that the Russians categorically refused. Then there were the increasingly desperate attempts from the Ukrainian side, reinforced by increasingly passionate pleas from the troops trapped in the Azovstal factory, that there should be some kind of extraction, that these troops should be not allowed to surrender to the Russians, but that they should be evacuated to a third country. And it's fairly clear that the country in question was intended to be Turkey, and that there have been many attempts diplomatically and otherwise to try to achieve that, except the Russians have point blank refused. And there have also been various attempts to try to exchange the people in the Azovstal factory for various people who Ukraine is holding. There were suggestions at one time that the Ukrainian politician Viktor Medvedchuk should be exchanged for people in the Azovstal factory, and other people, prisoners of war, all kinds of people, it was said, should be exchanged for these people in the Azovstal factory. Well, up to now, the Russians have adamantly said no. They've insisted that all the troops in the Azovstal factory should simply surrender, should lay down their arms and surrender, that there will be no evacuation and nothing of that sort. Well, something seems to have happened today, because we've got reports that early this morning a group of Ukrainian troops emerged from the Azovstal factory with white flags. And it seems at least 50 wounded Ukrainian soldiers were evacuated this way and taken to the Novoazov hospital in the Donets People's Republic. But there's also some suggestions that some Ukrainian soldiers who were not wounded have also surrendered. I wonder whether this is the first indications that some sort of crumbling of Ukrainian resistance in Azovstal is about to happen, and whether this trickle of people surrendering is likely now to become a flood. I'm going to say this: if the garrison in Azovstal does indeed surrender, then I suspect that this will be a blow to Ukrainian morale. The Ukraine has perhaps made a mistake in building up these fighters in the Azovstal factory as heroes who would fight to the death. I've made the comparison before with the Ukrainian garrison that was holding out in Donetsk airport during the fighting in 2015, and the catastrophic fall in Ukrainian morale when those troops in Donetsk airport were defeated against all Ukrainian information and expectations. I wonder whether the same thing will happen if the garrison in Mariupol eventually surrenders. But anyway, we may be at the early point of this. So it looks as if we might be at the end of seeing the end of this saga at the Azovstal factory, and it looks as if we're starting to see the first signs of a collapse in Ukrainian positions in the northern Donbass, perhaps causing a cascade effect with a collapse, not of course immediately, but over the next few days, perhaps weeks, perhaps even months in Donbass. We shall see. Now, all of this, of course, is happening, and of course there's been very little discussion about any of this in the media in the West. On the contrary, to the extent that I follow the British news, which is becoming less and less, I have to say, at least where the war in Ukraine is concerned, all the emphasis so far is still on the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv, with perhaps rather less than full coverage of what's actually happened around Kharkiv, and a rather misleading picture of what's actually happened around Kharkiv being given. But anyway, I do, as I said, to some extent follow the Western news, and they've been writing less about the fighting in Donbass. In fact, compared with the enormous, intense coverage of the fighting around Kiev in March, coverage of the war in Donbass has been very thin. Perhaps another sign that things have not been going very well for Ukraine there. But instead what we get is huge amount of coverage of the fact that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. Now, I'm going to do a separate program about this, but I'm going to repeat again a few things. Finland and Sweden may have been generally neutral countries during the Cold War. Finland was actually very friendly towards the Soviet Union, as it then was, during the Cold War. But Finnish and Swedish neutrality have been essentially fictional matters ever since the Cold War ended. And whilst this doesn't mean that from a Russian point of view, Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO is a matter of no importance, it's important not to overstate its importance either. The Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov said today that for Russia, Finland and Sweden joining NATO was already less significant than Ukraine joining NATO would be, because whilst Ukraine and Russia have territorial disputes which could always escalate into war, Finland and Sweden do not have territorial disputes with Russia. So there's much less risk of a military confrontation between Russia and Finland, say, than there ever was between Russia and Ukraine. I'd also add, by the way, that the Russians have far more intense feelings about Ukraine. There's hardly any Russian speakers in Finland, for example, and certainly no territories predominantly occupied by them. And as I've already said in other programs, I understand that from a Russian point of view, Finland and Sweden joining NATO actually simplifies their planning, their military planning, in the event of a war in this part of Europe, in the Arctic and the North Atlantic. But of course, what this decision by Finland and Sweden to apply for NATO membership is going to do is it's going to play into the hands of someone else. And that someone else is President Erdogan of Turkey. And President Erdogan is never someone to miss a chance to strike a deal when he can. And one can already see that he's using the issue of Swedish and Finnish joining of NATO to start making demands and to start raising his price. And what I predict is going to happen over the next couple of weeks is we're going to see a complicated negotiation going on as Western governments, which would face massive embarrassment if Turkey were to veto Finland's and Sweden's accession, at the next NATO summit meeting in June. What NATO governments are going to have to do is they're going to have to find some way of meeting President Erdogan's demands, which I suspect are going to grow and grow and grow. And all I would say is, President Erdogan, whatever you may think of him, is not to be criticised for this. If somebody gives you a gift, well, there's no reason why you shouldn't take it. There's no reason why Turkey should give its vote for Finnish and Swedish accession to NATO for free, and Erdogan is never someone to give anything for free. So it seems to me that if people in Washington and Brussels and Helsinki and Stockholm thought this was going to be a straightforward matter, they're going to find over the next few weeks that it's going to be rather more complicated than they think. Well, I'm assuming they will sort it out, and when they do, I will no doubt discuss it further, as we will discuss it on the Duran. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say this week, today rather. It seems as if we might be at the beginning of the end of the Azovstal saga. It looks as if the situation in northern Donbass may be approaching, well, let's say very much the beginning of the end, and that could in turn lead to perhaps the end of the Battle of Donbass. I hope so. And I would add that, of course, Ukraine is now struggling with a massive fuel crisis, a transport crisis. This must be compounding all kinds of other problems across Ukraine's economy. Well, that's a topic for a different program. But anyway, we will see what happens over the next few days. But that's me for the day. Thank you for joining me again. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Remember, if you're watching this program on Rumble, you go to the top of the video, you find a red maroon button. You can press it. That will take you directly to our Locals homepage. You can choose then to become an active Locals member, and you can join my Wednesday live streams, which take place every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And you can support us also via Patreon and Subscribestar. And don't forget also to go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check the subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.